Welcome to Beneath My Rib, trail mix for your spiritual journey. Your hostess is Kathleen Ann Thompson, international missionary, teacher and lecturer, and artistic director of Bellhurst Productions. Welcome, everybody, to Beneath My Rib. Our podcast today is entitled, Are You There? As a believer, this is a question I believe most of us have asked God often. Is God really there in our life when we perceive His presence and experience the relevance of His being in our life? Well, let's explore that very question. Let me start with sharing a few brief moments in my own life which have assured me that there is an intimate presence of God in my life and that He is relevant in my everyday life. I was raised in a believing family. Until I was 19, I was actually a very ardent believer. At that point in my life, a couple of very dramatic incidences happened, and I lost faith with God. I felt God hadn't lived up to His promise to me. And I did what only a 19-year-old knows how to do when they can't deal truly with a question like this. I just walked away from it. I walked away from my faith. I entered a 10-year period in which I walked directly opposite of the will of God and refused to acknowledge His existence. I lived a very amoral life, one in which actually God never entered. However, I pursued many kinds of exotic other spiritualities, but never Christianity. Finally, I found myself 10 years hence down the road, exactly the place Proverbs says we will find ourselves. You see, there is a way that seems right, but actually leads to death. And I found myself at that door of death. The death was mine. There wasn't any way forward. There wasn't any way back. There was only death ahead of me. It was a devastating, despairing moment, obviously, in my life. And I found myself in a room, on the floor, on my knees, in the dark, praying. I hadn't uttered a word of prayer or acknowledgement of God in 10 years. And I prayed, God, if you exist, I want to know that you know my name. I often thought in the years subsequent to that prayer that this was a very odd prayer for me to pray. Why would I pray if I had only one thing to ask, a non-existent God? I want to know you know me. The answer to that question became evident to me in the decades subsequent to that prayer. But in that darkness, I suddenly heard inside myself a voice. This was not the voice of my own linguistic brain. It didn't sound anything like my own brain. And it had an authority to it. It had a weighty depth of reality to it, a compassion to it, a wisdom that seemed to completely override my existence at that moment. The voice simply said, Kathleen, I love you. So evident was this voice being authentic in my perception that it changed my entire life. I knew at that moment God did exist. I knew at that moment that God did know me, Kathleen. And I did know at that moment that He loved me personally. The witness of that voice within me was that strong. Turned my whole life back to God and the glorious journey of beginning to know Him truly. A couple decades later, I was working at the Hotel Sheraton. I was now a divorced woman with 2 children who had passed on into the arms of Jesus, and I was trying to provide for myself and my one surviving child. I needed to work several jobs. I had no support at all from his father or from anybody else. I was working at the university as an instructor part-time. I was working in my own private business. I was working at the Hotel Sheraton late at night. I was working in the banquet department, and we often worked till 2 o'clock in the morning on parties. This took a great toll on my energy and my health. And many people said to me, "You really need to quit one of these jobs. Your health is falling apart." But I in no way could see a way for myself to continue to support my son and myself if I quit one of my jobs. So I just kept on diminishing my health reserves and actually my whole nervous system. One night I was at a party and I came down to the office in the bottom of the hotel where the banquet director was, and I came down to ask for a bottle of cognac to take up to the party. And this was a man, the director of this department, that was not a very nice man. He was a very vulgar man. He had a very foul mouth. He was an alcoholic. We often found him slumped over the desk when we came in to request something. And this was a man who was actually very, very, very unpleasant. Although he never used vulgarity in my presence, which was interesting. And he did like me. So this was not a man I had a personal problem with. But he was not a nice man. As I entered the hallway, he came out of the office, and the 2 of us were alone in that hallway. Nobody else was there. And he looked at me, and I came to him. I stopped, and I said, "I just came to request a bottle of cognac for the party upstairs." And he said, "Kathleen, it's time you quit this job." And rather than being absolutely shocked, because there was no provocation, there was nothing he had ever complained about my work at the hotel that would warrant such a statement, and out of the blue like this. But I wasn't shocked, because once again, I heard with my ears, out of this man's mouth, the very voice of God. I knew God had inhabited him and had spoken to me a wise counsel. Again, it was so powerful that at the end of that night's shift, I tendered my resignation. I quit. The income I was earning there was miraculously sort of made up, and we actually did better in the next few years than the years I had worked there. It was a counsel from the Holy Spirit, using a man who was far from being a believer or far from being a righteous man. Nevertheless, the presence of God's voice was unmistakable in that man that night. A couple decades later, I was in Latvia, having worked for several years in a mission there. There came a crisis in this mission, and all the goals and the vision of this mission were suddenly in jeopardy of falling apart and being totally destroyed. It was a very emotional time, a very sad time, and a very tragic time. I needed to drive back into Germany, and I went down from my room in the mission to my car at about 5:30 in the morning because it was going to be a 2-day drive back to Germany. I wanted to get an early start. And the pastor of this church met me in the field about 5:30 in the morning. And we were just standing there alone. And he said, I just wanted to get up and say goodbye to you. It looks like this is the end. And he had tears in his eyes. And I also was feeling very, very sad. And suddenly within me was a feeling, an emotion of faith. I mean, a surge of faith, as if a tidal wave had suddenly flowed over my soul. And there was just this huge certainty and faithful vision for the future. And I looked at him and I said, no, this is not the end. This is the beginning. And he looked to his left toward the sunrise in the sky, which was right over the forest. And he said, look at that. And I looked to my right, and there was the most beautiful, incredible rainbow I have ever seen. It had rained the night before. The sun was just coming up and thinning the fog over the forest. And this rainbow, from end to end, was hovering over the forest, peeking through the morning fog, coming clear every second. And as I looked at it, unbelievably, a second rainbow appeared in duplicate above it. It was a double rainbow, end to end. Truly, this was the presence of God in his creation, assuring us, signaling us, yes, it looks like an end, but it's a beginning. And it truly was. The last moment I want to share with you, and these are just four of a book full of moments like this in my life. And this was at the time where my 10-year-old daughter died of a brain aneurysm, and I went several months after her death to the beach, which was a place she loved and was always so happy there. And I had decided I would go there and review her photo books and have just a time of mourning for her. I went and I parked my car on the hill that overlooked the beach. I didn't go down and get out of my car or go into the beach. The beach was absolutely gorgeous, picture postcard, beautiful. The waves of the Pacific Ocean were just enormous, and the water so blue, the sky gorgeous as always it can be on a beautiful Southern California day. And the beach was full of humanity, the goodness of humanity, lovers and young kids with their dogs playing frisbee, and little tiny toddlers building things, and protective parents and old people strolling in memory. It was just a wonderful look at humanity. But I stayed in my car, and I looked at the pictures and was weeping over them. And suddenly something very strange happened. It seemed as if the edges of the pictures began to curl up, and it seemed as if the paper was old and cracked. And I thought maybe it was because my eyes were full of tears, and I wiped them and tried to look more carefully. But I had this same perception. And I said, in just a prayer I threw up to God, God, what's going on here? And then came a voice I knew all too well within me that said, she's not there. Those are just pictures. She's with me. So if you want to be with her, be with me. And I am out there in my creation, in my creatures. And I looked through the window of that car, and I looked at the goodness, the beauty, the love, the abundance of God. And I understood. I folded my books away, and I walked out of my car down to the beach to see God in His people, in His creation, and let Him talk to me. It is true. God is with us, Immanuel. That's why He will never abandon us. That's why He promised to be with us forever. Because He is in His creation, He is in His people. Francis Schaeffer, great theologian, author, and apologist, wrote probably his most famous book, God is there and He is not silent. Well, if that is true, then how do we experience this? How do we find the experience of God truly relevant in our life, truly intimate to us personally, that He knows our name? If we look at Romans 12:2, we see it says that we shouldn't be conformed to this world. We shouldn't think as this world thinks. But we need to continually be transformed. Not to this world, but to the perceptions of God, how He designed this world. We do this by renewing our minds, or more actually explicitly correct in the translation, it would be change the perceptions of our mind so that those perceptions agree with the mind of Christ. In that way, we'll know quite certainly what God's will is. We will know what is proper, pleasing, and perfect, what will satisfy us, what will be perfectly profitable in our life, what will be righteous and upstanding in our life. Renewing our minds to change our perceptions. This is the key. We change our perceptions by altering them so that they agree with God's mind, with the mind of Christ. That He has revealed to us in His book, the Bible. That He has shown us in His creation out there as we look at nature. You see, we perceive the world through our five senses. That's what He gave us, to perceive how our relationship is with the world. Just as spiritually we were given the five senses to perceive the Spirit of Christ, so we are told to experience Christ spiritually by tasting Him, for He is good, by hearing His voice, by feeling the touch of Him on our hearts and souls, by smelling the fragrance of His name. And in our natural world, we are to rely on our five senses. This is the only way we actually have information given to us about our existence and relationship with the natural world. It's a primary stimulus. That information comes into our mind, and perceptions are formed by our mind about that information. Thomas Aquinas wrote that we must discover God in this world through our five senses. He said that nature, our natural life, our perceived natural life, we might say, lies between the divine mind, the mind of God, which creates, which has designed creation, and our human mind, which is then allowed to discover it. So information from our five senses is designed in absolute truth by God. But when we receive it subjectively, according to a perceptive portfolio, which was created by our own personal life experiences, influenced by culture, education, historical context, etc., etc. It is not an absolute perspective of truth. It is not. It is a subjective perception based on who we are and what we have experienced. If I don't change my perspective, my mind's perception on things, so that it agrees with the perception of Christ's mind, then I will not be able to experience his presence in his creation or in his creatures relative to me. Let's take the example of fear. Everybody lives with a lot of fear. We have a lot of fears about provision, about being loved, about being free of guilt, about succeeding, all kinds of fears. But the mind of Christ says, do not fear. Don't fear. Because I didn't give you a spirit of fear. That's not mine. That comes from the enemy. I gave you the spirit of a sound mind, a mind that thinks like I do. And if you have the mind that thinks as I do, you will know that we can overcome any fear. If you think in this way, fear does not enslave us, but becomes a matter of, okay, how do I overcome this fear? I have a fear of not being provided for, a fear I will die in poverty. But your mind says quite the opposite thing, that you will always provide for me, that we will never see God's people begging bread. So how can I overcome that fear if I do not have the perception of being left destitute that the mind of Christ has? I can't. And instead I become fear-laden, fear of provision, fear of love, fear of all of these things that block the perception actually of his real presence in my life, providing for me. And I don't see it. It passes me by, and I don't recognize it, and I don't take it. People say that God isn't there because they're often looking for a supernatural appearance in which there's an emphatic direction given to us about our decisions. But this is not what the mind of Christ has written about in the Bible. But in fact, we are given free will. Why? Well, obviously, God doesn't want a robot loving him out of directive, out of an absolute order. He wants us to find our way to him and discover the love and the abundance that he has for us. If we take away our responsibility to move along this journey of life, developing the gifts that he gave us so that we can more clearly grow into a maturity, a likeness of mind with him. We can grow out of our own very narrow and parochial perceptions of life and begin to think as he does. We also take away our joy of discovering. One of my favorite verses in the Bible, Proverbs 25:2, says, "It is the glory of God to conceal something, but the glory of kings to ask about it, to discover it." So God is deliberately letting us discover his presence, discover the richness of his grace, discover the glories of our inheritance in Christ. He loves this. As we do, we develop, we grow in maturity, and we have the delight, the joy, and the honor of discovering the truth. I always like to think of this in relation to an Easter egg hunt. You know, when your children are tiny and you hide colored Easter eggs for them and you give them a little basket, and on Easter Sunday then they are delighted with trying to find all the little Easter eggs and all the candy that you've hidden. And oftentimes they're so very small you have to sort of help them find it. But you take such delight in hiding it because you know it will give them so much joy to discover it. And they feel so wonderful when they've discovered it. I believe it is the same with God. He loves for us to discover the fullness of His truth and to discover the presence that is so intimate in our life. What is our biggest hurdle and resistance to doing what we need to do, changing our perceptions so that they agree with Christ's? Doing that opens our life to the experiential presence of God. Well, what is it that is a resistance to us doing that? I believe one of the biggest hurdles is held offenses. And in our next episode, we're going to look at the difficulties in releasing held offenses because they block our way. They block our way into the door of abundant grace and the experiential awareness of the presence of God in our life in a personal, intimate, and relevant way. They inhibit our ability to actually renew our mind, change those perceptions so that we see that actually God is right there, and learn to hear Him, feel Him, touch Him, smell Him, taste Him in a real way that affects our life. Thanks for being here. Keep in touch with us. We love to hear from you. And if you're a theater enthusiast, you can check out my other podcast channel, Whispers in the Wings, where we converse about theater techniques. Till our next episode on Beneath My Rib, this is Kathleen Ann Thompson, wishing you inspiration and strength on your spiritual journey. You've been listening to Kathleen Ann Thompson on Beneath My Rib. Please visit us at www.bellhurst.com.